When we study literature seriously, we aren't just reading stories or poems. We are trying to understand how texts connect with history, culture, society, and ideas. And for that, scholars use several approaches, each of which gives us a different angle. We begin with the idea that literary research is built on a wide range of approaches. Some are contextual, focusing on the world around a text. Others are textual, looking closely at the language and structure. Then we have theoretical and conceptual approaches, which rely on ideas and frameworks to interpret literature. Each one works like a different lens. Change the lens and the same text may reveal something new. What makes these approaches exciting is that they are not just theoretical, they have real-world uses. For instance, a contextual approach helps us study how a novel reflects the political climate of its time. A textual approach might explain why a poet chose a particular rhythm. A theoretical approach can help us read a text through feminism, post-colonialism, or psychoanalysis. And a conceptual approach allows us to think about larger ideas behind the text. Researchers use these approaches to understand how literature speaks to society and how society shapes literature. Now, for any research to be effective, we need methods and methodologies. These are the tools and structures that guide our investigation. This chapter introduces some important ones. One of them is archival research, which has been asked in exam. Archival research deals with studying drafts, letters, notebooks, and manuscripts. Another is biographical research, which focuses on the writer's life, and this too has been mentioned in exam. These methods help us understand how a text was created, how it changed over time, and what shaped the author's thinking. You'll also come across methods like ethnography, where researchers study cultural practices and communities. Then there is deductive reasoning, which starts from a general idea and moves towards specific conclusions, and inductive reasoning, which moves from specific observations to general ideas. The chapter also covers qualitative methods, which focus on interpretation, quantitative methods, which involve data, and mixed methods, which combine both. Understanding these helps you choose the right method for the question you are trying to answer. Along with methods, the chapter discusses key research terms. Words like methodology, methods, tools, design, and techniques may sound similar, but each has its own meaning. These terms ensure that research is not only systematic but also ethical. Knowing the difference between them helps you plan your work carefully and carry it out responsibly. As the chapter moves forward, it introduces advanced concepts such as the cultural circuit model, which connects literature with personal memories, cultural traditions, and power structures. This idea has been asked in exam. It is especially useful in fields like oral history, where stories, voices, and lived experiences all shape literary understanding. The cultural circuit model reminds us that literature is not isolated. It lives within communities, traditions, and relationships. By the end of this chapter, you begin to see that literary research is not just about reading deeply, it is about using the right approach, choosing the right method, and being thoughtful and ethical in the process. For UGC NET aspirants, this chapter becomes a complete guide to understanding how literary research works both in theory and in practice. It prepares you to analyze texts critically and confidently, using tools that scholars rely on across the world. When we study literature, we don't rely on just one method. Instead, we use different approaches that help us look at a text from many angles. Think of these approaches as lenses. Each lens shows us something new, and together they help us understand a work more completely. Let's walk through some of the major ones in a simple conversational way. We begin with contextual approaches, which try to understand literature by placing it within the world in which it was created. These methods remind us that a text doesn't appear out of nowhere. It is shaped by the writer's life, historical events, and cultural surroundings. One familiar method is biographical criticism, and this particular approach has been asked in exam. Biographical criticism looks at a literary work as a reflection of the writer's experiences. Scholars use letters, diaries, and personal history to understand themes and creative choices. For example, when you read Sylvia Plath's Ariel alongside her journals, you start to see how her struggles with identity, relationships, and despair shaped her poetry. Another powerful contextual approach is new historicism. This method views literature as part of a larger network of cultural and political forces. New historicists study literary and non-literary texts together to understand how each reflects its time. Imagine reading Shakespeare's The Tempest along with colonial travel narratives. Suddenly, ideas of power, empire, and exploration become clearer. Literature and history speak to each other. We also have cultural studies, a method that explores how literature interacts with cultural identities, values, and power structures. This includes issues like race, class, gender, and even media. For instance, studying Toni Morrison's novels within African American cultural history shows how deeply literature is connected to community identity and collective memory. Another approach that feels almost like fieldwork is ethnographic research. Adapted from anthropology, it uses observation, interviews, and participation in literary studies. Ethnography might explore how certain groups engage with texts. Think of an online fandom around the Harry Potter series. By studying their discussions and interactions, you learn how literature helps create community bonds. Archival research, which has been asked in exam, is another essential method. This approach digs into manuscripts, drafts, letters, and early editions stored in archives. It helps scholars trace revisions and understand an author's thought process. For instance, looking at Virginia Woolf's manuscripts in the British Library reveals how she shaped Mrs. Dalloway through multiple drafts. Archival work can completely change how we read a text. Next, we come to comparative literature. This method crosses languages, cultures, and national boundaries. It highlights similarities, differences, and influences between texts. Reading Rabindranath Tagore alongside W.B. Yeats, for example, opens up rich conversations about cross-cultural influence in early modernism. Now let's turn to textual approaches, which focus on the literary work itself rather than the world around it. These approaches ask you to look closely at the structure, language, and techniques used in the text. One major approach here is formalism and new criticism. These methods encourage close reading. They ask you to focus on form, imagery, symbolism, and literary devices. External details like the author's life or historical context are deliberately set aside. The idea is simple, the meaning lies inside the text. Another textual approach is narratology, which studies how stories are told. Narratologists look at narrators, point of view, plot structures, and the use of time. They try to understand how these narrative choices shape a reader's experience. We also have rhetorical analysis, which studies how authors persuade or influence their audience. This approach examines the author's purpose, the intended audience, and the balance between logic, emotion, and credibility, often called logos, pathos, and ethos. Finally, we arrive at theoretical approaches which use specific literary theories as interpretive tools. These approaches allow us to explore deeper social, political, and psychological meanings in texts. Marxist criticism looks at class struggle, ideology, and economic power. Reading Animal Farm through this lens reveals how the text critiques hierarchy and totalitarianism. Feminist criticism examines gender representation and challenges patriarchal structures. Modern feminist critics often consider intersections of gender, race, class, and sexuality. Revisiting Jane Eyre, for instance, reveals it as a story about a woman's autonomy and resistance. Post-colonial criticism focuses on texts from formerly colonized regions. It studies issues like identity, hybridity, and resistance. Reading Things Fall Apart with Post-Colonial Insight shows how Achebe responds to colonial misrepresentations of Africa. Psychoanalytic criticism applies theories from Freud, Jung, or Lacan to explore unconscious desires and psychological conflicts. A classic example is reading Hamlet through the Oedipus complex to understand his hesitation. Next, reader response criticism reminds us that the meaning of a text doesn't live only on the page. It is created by the reader. Different readers bring different experiences, so their interpretations vary. For instance, people of different ages often read 1984 in completely different ways because their concerns and life experiences differ. Now let's talk about something that UGC NET students often struggle with but actually find quite enjoyable once it clicks: the conceptual approach in literary research. This approach focuses on ideas rather than data. Instead of collecting surveys, measuring results, or looking at statistics, conceptual research tries to understand and refine abstract notions such as identity, hybridity, exile, intertextuality, or narrative structure. In simple words, it studies concepts, not events. And this idea of focusing on abstract theories has been mentioned in exam, so keep it in mind. In literary studies, conceptual research often works with philosophy and critical theory. For example, when scholars talk about hybridity in post-colonial literature, an idea associated with Homi Bhabha, they aren't measuring anything. They are using a concept to understand texts like Midnight's Children. Similarly, the idea of exile helps us think about modernist or post-colonial poetry where writers feel separated from home, language, or culture. And when we talk about stream of consciousness, we're using a narrative concept to understand how writers like James Joyce and Virginia Woolf represent the mind's flow of thoughts. So the conceptual approach isn't just about reading one book. It's about developing frameworks that apply across many books, genres, and traditions. That's why UGC NE often asks questions based on concepts like hybridity, subalternity, or intertextuality. Once you understand the concept, you can apply it anywhere. Now, let's move to some further approaches that are commonly used in modern literary research. Think of them as different lenses you can use to look at a text. One major approach is structuralism. Structuralists believe that literature works like a system, almost like a language, filled with signs, patterns, and hidden structures. For instance, when scholars analyze folktales using Vladimir Prop's functions, they are looking for repeating narrative units that shape stories across cultures. A later development is post-structuralism and deconstruction, which challenges the idea of stable meaning. These approaches argue that texts contain tensions, contradictions, and moments where meaning slips. For example, deconstructing the binaries in Heart of Darkness can show how the text unsettles ideas about civilization and savagery. Semiotics is another method. It studies how signs and codes create meaning in literature and culture. In modernist poetry, for instance, a particular color or sound might signify a feeling, an atmosphere, or an idea. Then we have hermeneutics, the art of interpretation. Classical to modern thinkers like Gadamer and Ricoeur ask, how do readers and texts meet? Hermeneutics talks about the fusion of horizons, the moment when a historical text and a modern reader understand each other. A good example is interpreting Hamlet by blending what the text meant in its own time with how we read it today. Phenomenology explores the experience of reading. It focuses on the reader's consciousness and asks what it feels like to move through a story. For example, think about how Proust builds narrative delay. The lived experience of anticipation becomes the heart of the novel. Narratology is the science of narratives. It studies story, structure, time, voice, focalization, and plot. If you track how the point of view shifts in Wuthering Heights, you are using narratology. Another useful method is stylistics, including corpus stylistics. This approach uses linguistic analysis to study style. Researchers might study patterns in word frequency or look at how John Donne creates effects through metaphors and deviations from normal language. cultural materialism and new historicism place literature back into history. They study how texts interact with power and ideology. If you read The Tempest alongside colonial travel documents, you are practicing this method. Then we have critical race studies, which examines how race, representation, and power work in literature. Rereading Othello through Black Studies debates is a strong example. Queer theory explores sexuality and challenges normativity. When reading Woolf's Orlando, you might think about queer time, identity, and kinship. Disability studies asks how literature portrays disability and how society defines the normal body. In Toni Morrison's fiction, for example, bodily difference becomes a lens to study social framing. Eco-criticism, or environmental humanities, explores how texts relate to nature, animals, climate, and ecological crisis. You might study non-human agency in Walden and ask how the environment acts within the narrative. World literature and translation studies look at how texts circulate across languages and cultures. When Tagore's works are translated into English, their meaning and reception shift, and studying those shifts is part of this method. Reception theory and reader response focus on readers. They ask how different audiences interpret the same work across generations. For instance, readers today may understand 1984 differently from readers in the 1950s. Book history and the history of reading explore how books were produced, circulated, and read. Scholars look at title pages, marginal notes, printing history, and even how early readers reacted to certain editions. Genetic criticism studies the creative process by examining drafts, notebooks, and revisions. If you follow the manuscript stages of Mrs. Dalloway, you're using this method. Rhetorical and discourse analysis examine the arguments, persuasion, and structures of language within literature. A dystopian novel, for example, might hide political rhetoric inside its narrative. Finally, affect theory and cognitive approaches study emotions, embodiment, and how readers process narrative information. These methods help explain how novels like Beloved create empathy by guiding the reader's emotional responses. Performance studies, adaptation studies, and media studies complete the picture. They explore what happens when a text moves to the stage, screen, or visual media. Watching Macbeth across different film versions or tracking how stage traditions change the play is part of this approach. Taken together, these methods show how rich and flexible literary research can be. Each approach highlights a different aspect of the text, and each one opens a new door into understanding literature more deeply. Let's take a moment to understand two terms that often confuse students: research methods and research methodology. These words look similar, but they actually refer to very different things. Their difference has even been asked in exam, so it's worth getting it clear from the start. When we talk about research methodology, we mean the bigger picture, the overall approach, the guiding principles, and the philosophical ideas behind a research project. Methodology explains why a researcher chooses a certain path. It deals with the worldview behind the research, including questions about reality and knowledge, what we call ontology and epistemology. This orientation toward philosophical grounding has also come up in exam. On the other hand, research methods are the actual steps you take to carry out the research. This point has also appeared in exam. Methods include interviews, surveys, close reading, content analysis, archival digging, or even statistical evaluation. These are the concrete tools you use to collect and analyze data. In simple terms, methodology is the plan and methods are the actions. Research design brings everything together. It considers principles like measurement, sampling, case studies, surveys, and experimentation. These elements too have been mentioned in exam. Think of design as the blueprint that maps out how your research will be carried out using the methods you've chosen. And because research problems vary, methods must adapt to the situation. This idea, methods being shaped by context, has also been tested in exam. It's important to remember that methods and methodologies are not the same, and this distinction has been asked in exam. let's say you're working with feminist theory. That theory becomes your methodology. But the tools you use, interviews, close readings, or textual analysis are your methods. The theory guides your interpretation, while the methods help you gather and analyze information. Together they ensure your research is thoughtful, coherent, and grounded. Now, let's turn to a major method used widely in literary and cultural studies: ethnographic research. This topic has also appeared in exam, so let's break it down in simple terms. Ethnography is a qualitative approach where the researcher spends time within a community or social setting to understand how people live, think, and interact. The central idea is immersion, getting close enough to observe behaviors, listen to conversations, and understand the world from the participant's point of view. Working with cultural practices in context has been tested in exam as well. One key technique here is participant observation, where the researcher does not just watch but becomes part of the setting. This technique has also been noted in exam. The goal is not to remain distant or purely objective, but to understand how people make meaning in their daily lives. Because of this, ethnography aligns with post-positivist thinking, where absolute objectivity is not expected. This connection with post-positivism has also been mentioned in exam. Instead, the focus is on the subjective interpretations that shape human experience. Ethnography allows researchers to offer rich, personalized descriptions of cultural life. The ability to use personalized and contextual references is another point that has come up in exam. It offers flexibility too. Much like phenomenological approaches, ethnography adjusts itself to the environment, making it a dynamic method. This flexible nature has been tested in exam as well. A special form of this method is autoethnography, where the researcher uses their own life experiences as data to examine cultural patterns. Autoethnography has also appeared in exam. In educational settings, ethnographic research often works alongside case studies to explore the attitudes, values, and biases of teachers and students. This combination has been noted in exam. Ethnography is widely recognized for its ability to study cultural diversity in specific settings, and this purpose has also been asked in exam. In literary studies, it helps researchers understand how people read and interpret literature in their daily lives. One influential example is Janice Radway's Reading the Romance, 1984, which examined how women read and made sense of romance novels. The study's importance has also been tested in exam. Ethnographic research is often misunderstood. Some people think it aims to uncover an objective truth. But in reality, it focuses on how individuals and communities interpret their experiences. This clarification has also been asked in exam. Another well-known example is Reading National Geographic by Catherine Lutz and Jane Collins, published in 1993, which explored how the magazine shaped American readers' perceptions of the world. This work, too, has been highlighted in exam. We'll start with inductive reasoning. The inductive method works from the ground up. You begin with specific observations, and from those observations you build a general idea or conclusion. This movement from specific cases to a general principle has been asked in exam. For example, imagine reading several post-colonial novels and noticing that the theme of exile keeps appearing. From those repeated observations, you may develop a broader understanding of how exile functions in post-colonial writing. Inductive reasoning is powerful, but remember that its conclusions are probable, not absolute, because they depend on the evidence collected. And this very idea about probability has also appeared in exam. Now let's flip the direction. Deductive reasoning starts with a general theory or principle and applies it to a specific text. This top-down approach has been tested in exam as well. For instance, you may begin with feminist theory and apply it to Jane Eyre to explore how the novel portrays gender roles. In deduction, if your starting premises are sound, your conclusions follow with certainty. That's why deductive reasoning is often used to test theories in a clear and systematic way, ensuring that interpretations stay consistent and logical. The qualitative method focuses on non-numerical data, things like literary texts, interviews, images, and videos. This focus on non-numerical material has been asked in exam. It is ideal when you want to explore themes, symbolism, narrative patterns, or cultural meaning. Qualitative research is open-ended and allows for deep interpretation. Techniques include interviews, focus groups, participant observation, and content analysis, and this list of techniques has also been mentioned in exam. Qualitative methods are perfect when you want to understand human experiences, emotions, or cultural significance. In contrast, the quantitative method deals with numerical data, a point that has also been asked in exam. It uses statistics and measurable patterns. For example, you might survey readers from different age groups to see which genres they prefer and then analyze the numbers. Quantitative methods help identify trends and correlations. They include structured surveys, reader response experiments, and statistical studies of publishing data. These methods produce results that can be replicated and measured, which makes them especially useful for large-scale studies. Now, when researchers want the best of both worlds, they turn to the mixed method. This approach blends qualitative and quantitative research and has been asked in exam many times. For example, a study on modern poetry might use a survey to gather demographic data and combine it with interviews to explore personal interpretations. Mixed methods can be used one after another at the same time or layered together in a nested design, and that flexibility in design has also been tested in exam. This approach is helpful when a single method cannot fully explain a complex literary or cultural question. Let's now look at a few other key methods that often guide literary research. One major approach is the archival method, and this topic has been asked in exam. Archival research goes beyond simply reading old letters or manuscripts stored in libraries. It also asks deeper questions about the role of archives themselves. A famous example is Jacques Derrida's book Archive Fever from 1995, a work that has also appeared in exam. Derrida shows that archives are shaped by memory, technology, and power. He connects Freud's psychoanalytic ideas to the act of archiving, discussing memory repression, repetition, and the desire to preserve. His ideas remind us that archives are not neutral. They can preserve history, but they can also erase or distort it. This tension between preservation and destruction has also been noted in exam. Next is the biographical method, another topic that frequently appears in exam. This method studies an author's life using letters, memoirs, interviews, and autobiographies to interpret their work. The focus is on understanding how an author's experiences, relationships, and cultural background shape their themes and style. Since literature comes from a living person, this method helps us see how life and art influence each other. We also have the visual method, which has been mentioned in exam. This method looks at visual materials connected to literature. Illustrations, photographs, film adaptations, book covers, and digital media. It helps us understand how images interact with text, how visual design shapes meaning, and how literature moves across different forms. Finally, there is the creative method, another approach that has been asked in exam. This method invites researchers to engage creatively with literature through creative essays, fictional reinterpretations, poetic responses, or imagined dialogues. When you begin any kind of research, especially in literature, you come across a set of terms that look very similar but actually mean very different things. These include research methodology, research methods, research tools, research design, and research techniques. Students often mix them up, and questions from this area are regularly tested in exam, so let's break them down in a simple and easy to remember way. We start with research methodology. Think of methodology as the overall guiding philosophy behind a study. It answers the question why you are doing research in a particular way. It explains the worldview, the theoretical lens, and the reasoning behind your choices. This connection between methodology and the researcher's underlying philosophy has been asked in exam. For example, if you select a qualitative methodology based on post-colonial theory, You are choosing to examine issues like identity and power in colonial literature. That decision shapes the entire study. Methodology ensures that your research has a clear purpose, a logical flow, and a well-grounded justification for every step you take. Next, let's look at research methods. These are the actual strategies you use to collect and analyze your material. This idea of methods as practical steps has been asked in exam. If methodology is the blueprint, methods are the tools you pick up to execute it. In literary research, your methods might include close reading, archival research, interviews, or textual analysis. For example, if you want to study how readers interpret a poem, you might conduct interviews. If you want to explore an author's creative process, you might work with drafts or manuscripts. Methods turn your research plan into action. Now move to research tools. Which are the instruments you use while performing those methods? That distinction between tools and methods has also been tested in exam. Tools are things like JSTOR, MLA International Bibliography, digital archives, or software like NVivo for coding and analysis. Even simple things like reference managers or note-taking apps are research tools. They help you collect information accurately and analyze it efficiently. Then we come to research design, which is the overall plan or structure of your study. You can think of design as the roadmap that shows how your research will move from the problem to the findings. Designs may be exploratory, descriptive, or explanatory, but in literary studies, we also use something very important called the comparative research design. This design has been asked in exam. It helps scholars compare two or more texts, authors, genres, or periods. For example, if you compare the idea of exile in post-colonial novels with early modernist literature, you can understand how different historical moments produce different forms of emotional experience. Comparative design is valuable because it encourages interdisciplinary thinking and opens up fresh insights. Finally, we have research techniques. These are the small, detailed actions you take while using a method. Techniques turn broad methods into step-by-step procedures, and this idea has been mentioned in exam. For instance, if your method is textual analysis, your technique might be thematic coding, content analysis, or intertextual comparison. If your method is archival research, your technique might involve selecting specific manuscripts or tracking changes across drafts. Techniques ensure that your research is systematic and transparent. Now let's move to an advanced idea, the cultural circuit model. This is an important framework in literary and oral history research, and it has been asked in exam multiple times. Developed by Graham Dawson and Al Thompson, the model explains how culture, memory, identity, and power constantly interact with each other. Dawson and Thompson argue that memory is not just stored in the mind but shaped and reshaped through storytelling, institutions, media, and public narratives. This idea that memory follows cultural scripts has been tested in exam. The cultural circuit model shows that personal memories reflect broader cultural forces, and at the same time, cultural narratives are shaped by individual experiences. This back and forth movement helps researchers understand how memory is transmitted, questioned, or even erased over time. It is especially important in fields like memory studies and post-colonial research, where scholars analyze how communities remember trauma, displacement, conflict, or migration. This connection between memory, identity, and power has also been noted in exam. In literary research, the cultural circuit model helps us see how personal recollections influence storytelling, how cultural contexts shape narratives, and how literature becomes a space where private memory meets public history.